Friends, I come to you today with a message that many will dismiss, but those with spiritual eyes will recognize as urgent revelation. There is a battle raging in the invisible realm. Your home is spiritual territory, and God gave you smell to detect the presence of forces you cannot see. We live in an age that believes only what can be weighed or measured, yet we trust our noses every day without ever seeing the thing they warn us about. We smell smoke before we see fire, decay before we see rot, sweetness before we taste fruit, and we act accordingly because wisdom listens to quiet alarm. In the same way, there are warnings in the unseen that arrive not with thunder but with subtlety, not with spectacle but with discernment. And the tragedy of modern life is not that such warnings are absent, but that we have trained ourselves to ignore them while congratulating ourselves on being sensible. Ephesians 6:12 declares, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood," and in that single sentence, the illusion of a purely material life collapses. If our struggles were merely against people, money, time, or circumstance, then technique alone would save us. We could budget our way out of despair, optimize our way into peace, and hustle our way into meaning. But if our wrestling is deeper than flesh and blood, then the instruments of our victory must also be deeper than spreadsheets and schedules. A house can be spotless and still be unclean. A life can be prosperous and still be poor. A mind can be educated and still be deceived. And a home can smell wrong, even when every surface shines. I speak of odors not as superstition, but as metaphor sharpened by spiritual intelligence, because smell bypasses our arguments and goes straight to our instincts. It tells the truth faster than reason does. When something is wrong, the body knows before the intellect agrees. The heart recognizes danger before the tongue finds words. This is why corruption so often announces itself quietly. It does not crash through the door. It leaks, it seeps, it leaves a scent. And those who live well are not those who never encounter corruption, but those who have learned to recognize it early while it is still a smell and not yet a fire. Sulfur signals territorial demonic activity often connected to cursed objects. Think of sulfur not merely as a chemical, but as the odor of domination, the scent of something claiming space it does not own. It is the smell of a will that seeks to rule rather than serve. In human terms, sulfur is the atmosphere of greed that turns homes into marketplaces and people into commodities. When money ceases to be a tool and becomes a master, it leaves a sulfuric trail in the soul. The home becomes anxious. Conversation becomes transactional. Love becomes conditional. One begins to sense that something is always demanding, always hungry, never satisfied. The tragedy is that many mistake this pressure for ambition or responsibility, when in truth it is a counterfeit authority establishing territory in the heart. Wealth, when it rules, does not enrich. It occupies. It does not serve the home. It claims it. The smell of decay reveals unclean spirits feeding on hidden corruption, unresolved sin, or generational curses. Decay is slow, patient, and polite. It does not announce itself loudly. It waits for neglect. In the moral life, decay is what happens when we postpone repentance because nothing seems urgent yet. It is the quiet accumulation of resentment, the unspoken bitterness between spouses, the compromises we justify because everyone else is doing the same. Over time, the house of the soul begins to smell of something old and sour, and we open windows with distractions rather than cleaning the source. We buy more things, scroll more screens, work longer hours, hoping fresh air will fix what only truth can heal. But decay is not cured by ventilation. It is cured by removal. What is rotten must be exposed, confessed, and discarded, or it will continue to feed whatever thrives on neglect. Burning odors manifest during intense spiritual warfare, as the enemy releases fiery darts to intimidate believers pressing toward breakthrough. There are moments in life when growth feels like pressure, when doing the right thing suddenly becomes costly. when integrity seems to attract resistance rather than reward. This is when many turn back, mistaking opposition for a sign they are wrong. But fire is not always destruction. Sometimes it is refinement. The smell of burning in the moral life is often the discomfort of transformation, the pain of habits being challenged, the heat of discipline forging character. Yet there is a counterfeit fire as well, one meant not to refine but to frighten, to convince you that the cost of righteousness is too high. Discernment asks a simple question: is this fire purifying me or paralyzing me? One strengthens, the other intimidates, and the difference is felt before it is understood. Sweet or floral scents expose seducing spirits, masquerading as angels of light, disguising deception as peace and holiness. This is perhaps the most dangerous odor of all, because it feels good, it reassures, it flatters, it whispers that no change is necessary, that comfort is the same as goodness, that serenity can be achieved without truth. In the language of wealth, this is the seduction of abundance without responsibility, pleasure without purpose, success without stewardship. It smells pleasant because it appeals to our desire for ease. Yet beneath the sweetness lies stagnation. A life that never confronts itself may feel calm, but it does not grow. True peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of order, and order often requires disruption before it brings rest. Strong chemical or perfume smells point to objects carrying spiritual contamination that establish demonic authority in specific spaces. Perfume covers. Chemicals sterilize. Both can create the illusion of cleanliness without transformation. In our lives, these are the habits and possessions we use to manage appearances rather than reality. The image we curate, the language we adopt to sound virtuous without becoming virtuous. The symbols of success we display to reassure ourselves and others that all is well. But authority does not come from appearances. It comes from alignment. A home is not holy because it looks impressive, but because it is ordered around truth. A life is not abundant because it is full, but because it is rightly filled. These smells are warnings, calls to action, and opportunities to exercise spiritual authority. For authority without awareness is like a sword in the hands of a sleeping warrior. Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world, but that greatness must be awakened through responsibility. Submission to God is not weakness, it is alignment with reality. Resistance to corruption is not aggression, it is clarity. Cleansing the home is not ritual, it is intentional living. Removing cursed objects is not fear, it is wisdom. Repentance is not shame, it is liberation. Forgiveness is not forgetting, it is refusing to let decay spread. Declaring your dwelling place as holy ground is not arrogance, it is stewardship. And here the metaphor widens, because the home is more than walls and furniture. It is the inner chamber where thoughts dwell, where desires take shape, where values are rehearsed in silence before they are spoken aloud. When money replaces meaning, the house begins to smell wrong. When ambition outruns character, the air grows thin. When success is pursued without gratitude, the atmosphere becomes restless. The soul knows. It always knows. And it sends signals long before collapse occurs. The question is whether we will listen while there is still time to act gently rather than desperately. True abundance does not smell of sulfur or decay or counterfeit sweetness. It smells of gratitude, because gratitude keeps wealth in its proper place, as a servant rather than a sovereign. It smells of discipline, because discipline orders desire and prevents corruption from finding shelter. It smells of generosity, because generosity breaks the spell of ownership and reminds us that everything we hold is entrusted, not possessed. It smells of humility, because humility opens windows where pride would seal rooms shut. And it smells of purpose, because purpose gives weight to sacrifice and meaning to effort. In the end, this is not a message about demons lurking in corners, but about discernment living at the center. It is not an invitation to fear, but to awareness. A well-ordered life is not one that never encounters strange odors, but one that recognizes them quickly and responds with wisdom. The battle in the invisible realm is fought not with panic, but with truth practiced daily. When the home is aligned, the air clears. When the heart is ordered, peace follows. When money is dethroned and meaning restored, abundance becomes a blessing rather than a burden. So listen to what your life is telling you. Pay attention to the subtle signals. Do not dismiss discomfort too quickly, nor be seduced by sweetness that requires no growth. Clean what must be cleaned. Remove what must be removed. Align what has drifted, and you will find that the house, both within and without, becomes a sanctuary once more, a dwelling place where clarity replaces confusion, where purpose replaces pressure, and where the presence that reigns is not one of domination or decay, but of life, order, and enduring meaning. And when that presence settles, it does not arrive with spectacle. It does not shout. It does not force its way into rooms. It comes the way truth always comes, quietly, steadily, unmistakably, like clean air after a long storm. You notice it not because something dramatic has happened, but because something heavy is lifted. The tension you thought was normal loosens its grip. The urgency that once drove you begins to soften into intention. You realize, often with surprise, that peace is not the reward for having finished life's work, but the foundation from which meaningful work is finally possible. This is why the battle over your home, your inner home, matters so deeply. A person who lives in constant spiritual noise cannot hear wisdom when it speaks. A life filled with the odor of anxiety mistakes motion for progress. A heart clouded by unresolved corruption begins to confuse survival with success. And so people run faster, accumulate more, and achieve higher, all while breathing air that slowly weakens them. They wonder why abundance feels exhausting, why success tastes bland, why comfort still leaves them restless at night. They assume the answer is more money, more validation, more control, never suspecting that what they need is less contamination. There is a moment, often small and easily overlooked, when a person realizes that not everything they have allowed into their life deserves to stay. It may come as a quiet conviction, a sense that certain habits no longer fit, that certain conversations leave a residue, that certain ambitions smell faintly wrong. This is not condemnation. It is discernment maturing. It is the conscience sharpening its senses. And the wise do not argue with this moment. They do not drown it out with noise or bury it under busyness. They pause. They breathe. They ask not, how do I keep this? But what is this costing me? For wealth, when rightly understood, is not measured only by what it adds, but by what it demands. If it demands your integrity, it is too expensive. If it demands your family, it is overpriced. If it demands your peace, it is counterfeit. Money is a wonderful servant, but a ruthless god, and every god leaves an odor. The god of greed smells of sulfur, harsh, oppressive, territorial. The god of comfort smells sweet but stagnant, pleasant yet suffocating. The god of fear smells of burning, constant urgency without rest. And the god of appearance smells of perfume, masking decay rather than healing it. None of these can build a home that lasts. What, then, does a healthy life smell like? It smells like honesty, because nothing festers where truth circulates freely. It smells like forgiveness, because forgiveness clears rooms resentment would otherwise occupy. It smells like patience, because patience allows growth without forcing outcomes. It smells like responsibility, because responsibility anchors freedom to reality. And it smells like hope, not the fragile optimism of wishful thinking, but the durable hope that comes from aligning one's life with principles that do not rot over time. This alignment is not achieved in a single dramatic act. It is formed through daily choices so small they seem insignificant, yet together determine the atmosphere of an entire life. It is choosing restraint when indulgence beckons. It is choosing generosity when accumulation feels safer. It is choosing silence when anger wants a voice. It is choosing reflection when distraction offers relief. These choices cleanse not by spectacle, but by consistency. Over time, they change the air. Over time, they change the person. And here is the quiet miracle. As the inner home becomes ordered, the outer world begins to respond differently. Opportunities no longer feel predatory. Relationships no longer feel transactional. Work becomes meaningful rather than consuming. Wealth finds its proper scale, no longer towering over the soul, no longer shrinking it, but standing proportionate, useful, integrated. One discovers that abundance is not the absence of limits, but the presence of harmony. Enough replaces excess. Purpose replaces pressure, and gratitude replaces anxiety as the governing tone of the heart. There will still be moments when strange odors appear, when life signals that something is off. This is not failure, it is maintenance. Even the healthiest homes require attention. Even the wisest lives encounter seasons of clutter and drift. The difference now is that you will recognize the warning sooner, respond more calmly, and act more decisively. You will not panic, because fear no longer rules the house. You will not deny, because pride no longer guards the door. You will simply clean, realign, and continue. In this way, spiritual authority is exercised not through loud declarations, but through quiet faithfulness. Not through obsession with darkness, but through commitment to light. Not through constant warfare language, but through a life so ordered that corruption finds no place to settle. The enemy does not need to be chased from a house where truth already reigns. Deception cannot breathe where clarity fills the rooms. Greed loses its grip where generosity is practiced, and fear retreats where trust has been patiently built. So let your home, your thoughts, your habits, your ambitions, your relationships become holy ground, not because it is perfect, but because it is honest. Let it be a place where growth is welcomed, where correction is not feared, where wealth serves rather than rules, and where meaning sits at the center like a steady flame that gives warmth without consuming everything around it. When this happens, the air changes. Others will sense it before they understand it. They will feel lighter in your presence, calmer in your words, steadier around your choices, and you will know, without needing to prove it, that something has been set right. For the truest sign of a life aligned is not dramatic power, but quiet freedom. Freedom from compulsion, freedom from fear, freedom from the endless hunger that no amount of money can satisfy. This is the abundance that does not rot, the wealth that does not enslave, the presence that does not contaminate but renews. And when you breathe that air deeply and without hurry, you will recognize it at once, not as something strange, but as something you were always meant to come home to. And home, when finally understood, is not merely a place you return to at the end of the day, but a condition of the soul you carry into every room you enter. Many live their entire lives moving from house to house, job to job, relationship to relationship, without ever inhabiting themselves. They furnish the exterior while the interior remains neglected. Locked rooms accumulating dust, unspoken fears stacked like boxes in the dark. Yet nothing truly changes until a person dares to walk through their own inner halls with the light on, willing to notice what has been stored there, willing to smell what has been ignored. This is why awakening often feels uncomfortable before it feels liberating. When the air begins to clear, it stirs what has settled. Old assumptions rise. Long-held excuses lose their camouflage. You realize how often you have mistaken noise for vitality, urgency for importance, accumulation for progress. You see how easily the soul can be bribed with comfort, how quickly it can be intimidated by scarcity, how subtly it can be lulled into sleep by routines that ask nothing of it. And in that moment of seeing, there is a choice: to retreat back into familiar fumes, or to stay present long enough for real cleansing to take place. Staying is the harder path. It requires patience, because transformation rarely happens on our preferred timetable. It requires humility, because admitting something smells wrong means admitting we missed it before. It requires courage, because removing what contaminates the air often means letting go of what once made us feel safe. Yet this is precisely where moral strength is formed, not in grand gestures, but in the willingness to endure the slow work of alignment. Character is not forged in moments of applause, but in quiet decisions made when no one is watching, when the only witness is conscience itself. Wealth, viewed through this lens, becomes less a destination and more a test. It reveals what we trust, what we fear, what we believe will save us. When money is scarce, it tempts us to compromise. When money is abundant, it tempts us to forget. Both conditions release their own odors, their own distortions of perspective. The wise do not romanticize poverty, nor idolize riches. They treat both as climates that require discernment. They learn to ask, in every season, not merely, what can I gain, but what is this doing to my inner air? A life ordered around meaning develops a certain resilience. It can face loss without collapsing and success without swelling. It can receive criticism without bitterness and praise without intoxication. This resilience is not hardness. It is flexibility, grounded in principle. Like a well-built house, it can withstand weather precisely because it is neither rigid nor careless. It bends where it should, stands where it must, and allows nothing corrosive to linger unchecked. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, something shifts. The constant vigilance relaxes. The inner world becomes less reactive, more responsive. You no longer feel the need to justify every choice or defend every boundary. Peace takes on a weight, a solidity, as though it has roots rather than wings. You discover that contentment is not complacency, but clarity about what truly deserves your energy. You work with focus rather than frenzy. You rest without guilt. You give without resentment. You receive without fear. This is the point at which spiritual language stops feeling abstract and starts feeling practical. Words like integrity, stewardship, gratitude, and purpose cease to be ideals you admire from a distance and become habits you practice daily. They shape how you spend your money, how you speak to your family, how you structure your time, how you respond to temptation. They become the invisible architecture of a life that holds together under pressure. And from that architecture flows an atmosphere that needs no explanation. People will ask you what changed. They will expect a technique, a strategy, a dramatic event. You may struggle to explain, because the truth is both simpler and deeper than they imagine. You did not add something extraordinary. You removed what was corrupting the air. You did not become someone else. You returned to who you were meant to be before fear, greed, and distraction took residence. You learned to listen to the subtle warnings, to respect the signals of the soul, to treat life not as a conquest but as a stewardship in a world intoxicated with excess. This kind of clarity feels almost revolutionary. It stands quietly against the belief that more is always better, that faster is always wiser, that louder is always stronger. It reminds us that what we allow to linger unseen often shapes us more than what we proudly display, and it invites us again and again to choose cleanliness over concealment, alignment over appearance, meaning over money as the center of gravity in our lives. When this choice is made consistently, the result is not a life free of struggle, but a life free of needless contamination. You still face challenges, but they no longer poison the air. You still encounter temptation, but it no longer establishes residence. You still work for provision, but provision no longer works you. And in that freedom, you begin to sense the deeper abundance that was always available, the abundance of a clear conscience, a steady heart, and a home within and without, where life can breathe. And so the journey continues, not toward perfection, but toward wholeness, not toward domination, but toward harmony, not toward a kingdom built on accumulation, but toward a dwelling shaped by truth. This is the awakening that does not fade with time, because it is rooted in reality itself. And once you have breathed this air, once you have known what it is to live unburdened by unseen corruption, you will never again be satisfied with anything that merely looks successful while quietly smelling wrong. And there comes, inevitably, a moment of recognition so still it almost escapes notice, when you realize that the greatest battle you feared was never against the world outside, but against the slow drift within. You see how easily the soul can wander without ever announcing its departure, how values erode not through rebellion but through neglect, how the most dangerous compromises arrive dressed as conveniences. Nothing dramatic happened, no collapse, no scandal, just a gradual acclimation to air that was no longer clean until you forgot what clarity once felt like. This is why awakening feels less like discovering something new and more like remembering something old. A memory surfaces not of an event, but of a standard, a sense that life was never meant to be this frantic, this cluttered, this inwardly noisy. You recall, perhaps dimly at first, that strength was once associated with restraint, that wealth once bowed to wisdom, that success once answered to conscience. And as this memory sharpens, so does your resolve, not with anger, but with quiet determination. You begin to reorder, not because you are afraid of darkness, but because you have tasted light and refuse to live without it. Reordering a life is rarely convenient. It disrupts routines that once felt harmless. It exposes attachments you defended as necessary. It asks questions you would rather postpone. Yet there is a strange relief in this disruption, as though the soul itself exhales after holding its breath for years. You stop pretending that everything is fine when it isn't. You stop confusing tolerance for wisdom. You stop calling exhaustion a badge of honor. And in doing so, you reclaim a dignity that cannot be purchased, only practiced. This dignity reshapes how you think about effort. Work is no longer an escape from emptiness, nor a frantic attempt to secure worth. It becomes an expression of responsibility, a way of contributing rather than compensating. Money follows this shift naturally. It ceases to be proof of value and becomes a resource for value. You no longer ask it to give you identity, because identity has been anchored elsewhere. You no longer demand that it guarantee safety, because you have learned that no amount can protect a disordered soul. And freed from these impossible expectations, wealth finally finds its rightful place, useful, powerful, but no longer sacred. There is a humility that grows here, one that does not belittle the self, but situates it properly. You recognize how little control you truly have, and how much stewardship you have been given. You stop trying to dominate outcomes and start tending processes. You invest in habits rather than fantasies, in character rather than image, in meaning rather than momentum. The pace of life changes. Not because ambition has died, but because it has matured. You still aim high, but you aim clean. You still pursue excellence, but not at the cost of your inner air. And something remarkable happens when this maturity takes root. Gratitude ceases to be a polite gesture and becomes a lens through which everything is seen. You notice what is enough. You savor what is present. You give thanks not because life is perfect, but because it is ordered. Gratitude sharpens discernment. It reveals how much noise was unnecessary, how many cravings were manufactured, how many fears were inherited rather than chosen. It clears the senses. It restores proportion. And in doing so, it protects the soul from the endless dissatisfaction that fuels corruption. This protection is subtle but strong. Temptation does not vanish, but it loses its urgency. Comparison still whispers, but it no longer commands attention. You can admire without envying, desire without grasping, plan without obsessing. You become harder to manipulate, not because you are suspicious, but because you are grounded. The world's fragrances, its promises, its pressures, its illusions pass through your awareness without settling. You smell them for what they are and move on. Such a life may not always look impressive by conventional standards. It may appear quieter, less frantic, less adorned, but it carries a weight that cannot be imitated. A steadiness others feel instinctively, a clarity that reassures without preaching, a presence that does not dominate a room, yet subtly orders it. This is moral authority in its truest form, not imposed, but embodied, not announced, but recognized. And in the end, this is the deepest revelation, that the battle for the home, for the heart, for the meaning of wealth and work and purpose, is not won through fear of corruption, but through love of order. You do not cleanse because you are terrified of darkness. You cleanse because you cherish light. You do not reject false abundance because you despise pleasure. You reject it because you have discovered joy. You do not resist corruption because you are rigid. You resist it because you are free. Freedom, once tasted, becomes its own guardian. It alerts you when something threatens to dull it. It sharpens your senses. It teaches you to listen to the subtle warnings, to the quiet invitations, to the truth that does not shout but endures. And as you listen, as you respond, as you continue the patient work of alignment, you find yourself living in a home that breathes, a life that holds, a purpose that does not decay. This is not an ending, but an arrival that renews itself each day, a continual choosing of clarity over clutter, meaning over money, stewardship over possession. And in this choosing, again and again, the air remains clean, the heart remains awake, and the abundance you carry is no longer measured by what fills your hands, but by what steadies your soul.